Judge not, 2 words, and almost everyone knows them, even people who've never opened a Bible. It's the verse people quote to end an argument, to shut down a criticism, to defend a choice nobody's allowed to question. And there's a reason it gets used that way. On the surface, it sounds absolute. Jesus said, "Don't judge." Simple. Case closed. But sit with the passage a little longer, and something strange starts to happen. 2 verses later, in the very same breath, Jesus tells his listeners to discern who is and isn't ready to receive what's holy. A few chapters later, he tells them to recognize false prophets. By their fruit, he says, you will know them. That's not, don't judge. That's judging with your eyes open. So either Jesus contradicted himself in the space of 5 sentences, or judge not never meant what we've been using it to mean. The gap between those 2 possibilities is where this video lives. And the answer starts with a word Jesus never actually used, never. To understand that, you have to stand where the words were first spoken. The year is somewhere around 28 AD. The place is a hillside above the Sea of Galilee, the kind of open, sloping ground that carries a voice further than you'd expect. Below, fishing villages line the water. Capernaum, Bethsaida, Chorazin, towns built on trade, salt, and nets. This is Galilee, not Jerusalem. It's under the rule of Herod Antipas, a Roman client king with a fondness for building projects and a reputation for watching his own back. Rome governs from a distance, through men like Antipas, but its presence is felt everywhere, in the taxes, in the roads, in the soldiers who occasionally pass through on patrol. The crowd on that hillside isn't uniform. Fishermen with salt still in their clothes, day laborers, and scattered among them, scribes, men trained for years in exactly how to tell right from wrong under Jewish law. That detail matters because judgment in this world is not an abstract idea, it's an institution. Every town of any size has elders who sit at the gate, the customary place, going back centuries, where disputes are heard and decisions are made. A property dispute, a broken contract, a family matter too serious to settle privately, all of it moved through this same familiar process, in full view of the community. Deuteronomy commanded it outright, appoint judges, and judge the people with righteous judgment, not favoring the poor out of pity, not favoring the powerful out of fear, a standard applied evenly, because the same law bound everyone standing before it. Leviticus commanded that same community to reason honestly with one another rather than let sin go unaddressed in silence, rather than carry a private grudge that never gets spoken. Judging, in other words, isn't something Israel's law tried to eliminate. It's something Israel's law required, carefully, deliberately, with a standing warning that judgment itself could be corrupted by favoritism, bribery, or pride. And it wasn't only legal. This was also an honor-shame culture, where a person's standing in the community mattered enormously, and a public verdict against someone, even an informal one, spoken in the marketplace or at the well, could follow them for years. In a world like that, judge not isn't a throwaway phrase about internet arguments and comment sections. It's landing on people who understand exactly how much weight a spoken judgment carries, because they've watched it reshape a neighbor's reputation overnight. So when a voice on that hillside opens with 2 words, judge not, it doesn't land in a vacuum. It lands in the middle of a society that has judged, formally and informally, for as long as anyone standing there can remember. And it lands on a specific kind of listener. Because this sermon, as Matthew records it, has already spent several minutes taking aim at a very particular failure, people who perform righteousness outwardly while something else is happening underneath. Prayer for show, fasting for attention, certainty without self-examination. That's the audience judge not walks into, which means, before asking what the phrase forbids, there's a better question waiting underneath it, one the text itself is about to answer, if you keep reading past the first sentence. Here's the sentence in full, the way Matthew records it. Judge not, that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. That's verses 1 and 2 together. 2 words became a slogan. The sentence itself is longer, and it isn't finished making its point yet. Look again at the second half. With the measure you use, it will be measured to you. That phrase, the measure you use, isn't a poetic flourish. It's borrowed language. In the law of Moses, measure refers to something specific and unglamorous. Honest weights and honest scales. Leviticus and Deuteronomy both address it directly. Don't cheat people with a dishonest measure. A heavier weight for buying and a lighter one for selling. A merchant quietly tilting the scale in his own favor, while telling his customer the transaction was fair. It's commercial law. Marketplace ethics, the kind everyone in that crowd would have encountered firsthand, buying grain or oil or wool from a stall in town. So picture what Jesus is doing. He's taking language his listeners would have recognized instantly, the language of fair dealing, of not rigging the scale, and applying it to something more personal, how you evaluate other people. Not, don't judge, because judging is forbidden. Something closer to, Benu rig the scale. A dishonest measure was never really about the object being weighed. It was about the person holding the scale, one weight for their own goods, a harsher one for everyone else's. That's the failure Jesus is naming here. Not evaluation itself, a rigged evaluation. The text doesn't leave that as an abstract principle for long. It gets specific, fast, almost uncomfortably so. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? It's a strange image on purpose. A speck of sawdust in someone else's eye, small, real, worth caring about. A log in your own, physically impossible to miss, and somehow missed entirely. Jewish teachers of this period regularly used exaggeration like this to make a point stick. Nobody in that crowd would have thought Jesus meant an actual plank of wood. They'd have understood immediately, this is deliberately absurd, and it's supposed to be. Here's the detail worth slowing down for. The speck is real. Jesus never says it isn't there. He never tells the listener the speck doesn't matter, or that the brother isn't actually struggling with something. The problem was never that a flaw was noticed. The problem is the size of what's being ignored in the noticer. Picture a man walking around with a splinter lodged in his own vision, confidently pointing out that someone else's coat is torn. The observation might even be accurate. It's the angle it's coming from that's the issue. Not, you saw something true about another person and that makes you wrong. Rather, you saw it while carrying something far larger, unexamined, in yourself. Not sight, selective sight. Most retellings of this passage quietly stop right there, at the log and the speck, as if the point is simply, don't be a hypocrite, and the sermon moves on. But it doesn't move on. It finishes the sentence, and the ending changes what the whole illustration was actually for. You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Read that final clause slowly. Then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. That's not a command to leave the speck alone forever. It's not mind your own business dressed in an eye metaphor. Jesus tells the listener exactly what to do with the speck. Remove it. He just refuses to let that happen out of order. This is the detail almost nobody stops on. The whole illustration is aimed at a future, corrected act of help, not permanent silence. The sequence isn't judge never. It's self first, then clearly, log, then sight, then speck. Not a ban on ever addressing what's wrong in someone else's life. A required order of operations before you're qualified to do it well. And Matthew's Gospel isn't the only place this teaching survives. Luke records the same sermon, delivered on a plain rather than a mountain, and his version adds a small but telling detail Matthew doesn't include. In Luke's account, Jesus says, "Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned." Two verbs, sitting side by side, where Matthew only gives us one. Many scholars read this as significant, that Luke's condemn clarifies what kind of judgment is actually in view. Not evaluation in general, but a verdict pronounced with finality, the kind that closes a case rather than opens a conversation. That reading is widely held among commentators, though it isn't the only way the text has been understood, and it's worth holding with some humility rather than certainty. There's a related detail in the Greek itself, and it deserves the same caution. The word translated judge in Matthew is krino, a term with a genuinely broad range. It can mean condemn. It can also simply mean to evaluate, to discern, to decide between two things. The same root shows up later in John's Gospel, where Jesus tells a crowd in Jerusalem, "Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." Same word, family. Opposite instruction, which tells us something important on its own. This vocabulary was never fixed to one meaning. Context decides what it's doing in any given sentence. And in Matthew 7, the context is a rigged scale and an unexamined log, not evaluation as a category. There's also a more technical observation some Greek scholars raise about the grammar of judge not itself. The verb form Jesus uses is what's called a present imperative, and present imperatives in Greek can sometimes carry an ongoing or habitual sense, closer to stop your pattern of judging than a flat, one-time, never judge, ever. This is a real area of discussion in New Testament grammar, but it's also genuinely debated among specialists, and it shouldn't be leaned on as settled proof. It's one thread among several, worth knowing, not worth overstating, which raises the question the sermon still hasn't answered. If judgment isn't the problem, if the real target is a rigged scale and an unexamined log, then why, just one sentence later, does this same teacher tell the crowd not to give dogs what is holy and not to throw pearls to pigs? That's not self-examination. That's a verdict about who's in front of you. And it comes almost before the ink is dry on judge not at all. If you've read this passage 100 times and never noticed that first take the log out ends with, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out, you're not alone. Most of us stop at the hypocrite line and never finish the sentence. That single clause quietly changes the meaning of the verse everyone thinks they already know. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, passages you thought you understood, taken apart slowly and put back together, this channel exists for exactly that. Subscribing means you won't miss the rest of this one, or the ones after it. Because we're not finished. Jesus just told his listeners to remove the log, then remove the speck. That sounds like a two-step process ending in judgment being made. Carefully, but made. And one sentence later, he says something that sounds even more direct than judge not ever did. Not to give what is holy to dogs. Not to throw pearls before pigs. Someone has to decide who the dogs are. Someone has to decide who the pigs are. That's not restraint. That's a verdict, spoken almost in the same breath as the most famous anti-judgment line in the Bible. Worth pausing on this one a moment longer, because the image itself carries cultural weight easy to miss now. Dogs and pigs weren't household pets in this world. Both animals were considered unclean under Jewish law, and both carried strongly negative associations in everyday speech. Calling something for the dogs was a way of saying it had been thrown away, given to something incapable of valuing it. Exactly what that image was meant to represent, outsiders, false teachers, or simply people unwilling to receive correction, is genuinely debated among interpreters, and the text itself doesn't spell it out. But whatever the precise referent, the point holds either way. The image requires the listener to size someone up first, to reach some kind of conclusion about their readiness or posture, before deciding how to act toward them. That's assessment. It's sitting one breath after judge not, from the same mouth, in the same sermon. It isn't the only place discernment shows up in this sermon either. A few verses later, Jesus warns the same crowd about false prophets, and tells them plainly how to recognize one. You will recognize them by their fruits. Recognizing a false prophet requires the exact thing judge not supposedly forbids. Watching someone's life, weighing what you see, and reaching a conclusion about it. And later still, in a different part of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus lays out an actual process for what to do when someone in the community sins. Go to them privately, then with witnesses, then bring it to the church. That process only functions if someone is willing to name what's wrong out loud. Paul, writing to the church in Galatia, describes the same posture. Restore a brother caught in sin, not by looking away, but gently, watching yourself while you do it. So what is that verse actually doing there? Sitting one sentence after judge not, asking the crowd to sort dogs from something holy. There's a detail that's easy to miss the first 10 times you read this passage, because it isn't in Matthew at all. It's in a letter written by a man who never heard this sermon in person. Paul opens the 2nd chapter of Romans like this: "Therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things." Read that again slowly, and something starts to surface. You have no excuse. Every one of you who judges, you condemn yourself. That's not just a similar idea to Matthew 7. That's close enough to be almost a quotation. The same structure, the same warning, even the same logic about the judge being caught in his own standard. Paul is writing to a church in Rome that, as far as we know, never sat on that hillside in Galilee. And yet this exact teaching has reached him intact years later, and he's using it the way Jesus did, as a warning against a rigged scale, not a warning against evaluation itself. That alone is worth pausing on. But it isn't the detail that matters most. Because 3 chapters later, in a different letter to a different church, this same man writes something that sounds like it belongs to a completely different conversation. Writing to the Corinthians about a man in their church living in open, unaddressed sin, Paul asks them directly, "Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge?" Not a suggestion, a rhetorical question with an obvious, expected answer. Yes, Paul is telling this congregation, in plain language, to judge someone, by name, inside their own community. Here's where it becomes worth sitting with. This is the same man, the same theological mind, the same collection of letters, sitting side by side in the same New Testament. One passage telling a church, "You have no excuse, every one of you who judges," and another telling a church, "You are the ones who should be judging this man's conduct." If "judge not" meant what it's popularly assumed to mean, Paul contradicted himself in his own writings within the same decade, quite possibly to churches that read both letters. But he didn't, and the reason he didn't is the same reason Jesus never did. Look again at how Paul frames the Romans warning. Not "you judged," but "you condemn yourself because you practice the very same things." The failure isn't in the verdict, it's in the judge's own hidden guilt while pronouncing it. That's the log. That's the rigged scale. And in Corinth, Paul isn't asking anyone to pronounce judgment from a place of secret hypocrisy. He's asking a community to address sin openly, together, without pretending it isn't there. James, writing to yet another audience, adds a related warning of his own: "Don't speak evil of a brother, or judge him, because doing so sets you up as a judge of the law itself, rather than someone who lives under it." Different writer, different congregation, but the same underlying concern surfaces again. Not the act of evaluating, but the posture of setting yourself above the very standard you're applying to someone else, as though you were the lawgiver rather than someone equally bound by the law. Taken together, these 3 writers, Matthew recording Jesus, Paul writing to 2 separate churches, James writing to a third, show something worth naming plainly. This wasn't one isolated saying that later generations had to puzzle over in isolation. It was a principle the earliest Christian communities actually lived by, applied consistently across different cities, different problems, different decades. The consistency itself is part of the evidence. If "judge not" had genuinely meant never evaluate anyone for anything, it's difficult to explain how the movement's earliest and most influential writers kept instructing their churches to do exactly that, carefully and always with the same warning attached about self-examination first. Same principle, different letters, different churches, one consistent thread running underneath all of them, all the way back to a hillside in Galilee, which means this was never a private theory about how Matthew 7 might work if you look at the Greek long enough. This is how the earliest readers of this teaching, men writing within living memory of the sermon itself, actually applied it, not as a gag order on discernment, as a warning against judging from a position you haven't examined yourself. It's worth pausing on one more thing here, because it's part of how this verse lives in popular memory. A lot of people associate "judge not" with a different story entirely. A woman caught in adultery, dragged before Jesus, and a crowd ready to stone her, until Jesus says, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone." It's a powerful scene, and it echoes the same heart as Matthew 7. But that particular story doesn't appear in the earliest and most reliable manuscripts of John's Gospel, and most textual scholars regard it as a later addition to the text, likely a true and ancient tradition about Jesus, but one that wasn't originally part of John's own writing. It's honest to mention why the two get paired together in people's minds. It isn't honest to use one as if it were direct evidence for the other. The log has to come out first. Then the church becomes the kind of place that can honestly say to one of its own, "This isn't right, and here's why." Not despite "judge not," because of what "judge not" actually meant all along: a hillside above the water. A crowd carrying centuries of law in their memory. Two words that would outlive every person standing there. Judge not. Except the sentence never stopped there. It kept going, into a measure and a scale, and a warning about which weight you use for yourself and which one you use for everyone else. Into a log so large it should have been impossible to miss, and somehow wasn't. Into a speck, real and small and still worth removing, just not first. Into dogs and pearls, and a decision Jesus asks his listeners to make almost the moment "judge not" leaves his mouth. Not a ban, an order. Self, then sight. Log, then speck. And it didn't end on that hillside. A man named Paul, writing to a church he may never have visited in person, picked up the same warning almost word for word. "You have no excuse, every one of you who judges," and in a different letter, to a different church, told another congregation to do exactly that. Judge the man inside your own walls. Address what everyone can see and no one will say. Same teacher, same principle, different churches, one thread. Not never evaluate. Never evaluate from a scale you've rigged in your own favor. Not stay silent forever. Stay silent long enough to look at yourself first. The verse everyone quotes to end a conversation was never written to end conversations. It was written to order them. Self before speck, honesty before verdict, the log out before the hand ever reaches for someone else's eye. That's not a smaller command than "don't judge." It's a harder one. There's a particular kind of certainty that feels good to hold. The moment you can see clearly what someone else has done wrong, the shortcut they took, the way they hurt someone, the thing they should have known better than to do, there's a strange, quiet satisfaction in it. It doesn't even feel like pride. It feels like clarity. That's what makes the log so easy to miss. Nobody walks around aware of the log. That's the whole nature of it. It sits exactly where you can't turn your head far enough to see it. Everyone else's speck is visible from across the room. Your own log is invisible from the inside. Which means the uncomfortable question was never really, do you judge people? Almost everyone does, in some form, every day. A glance, a private conclusion, a story you tell yourself about someone's motives before you've asked them a single question. The question underneath the question is quieter than that. What are you carrying that you've stopped being able to see? Maybe it's not sin in the dramatic sense. Maybe it's a wound that's turned into an edge, a grudge that's calcified into discernment, a fear of being hurt again that now sounds, in your own head, like wisdom about other people. The log rarely announces itself as a log. It usually sounds reasonable. It usually sounds like you're just being honest. Think about the last time you felt completely certain about someone else's character, their motives, their failures. That certainty rarely comes with a warning label. It doesn't announce itself as bias or wound or self-protection. It just feels like seeing clearly. And that's precisely what makes Jesus' image so unsettling the longer you sit with it. A log doesn't feel like a log to the person carrying it. It feels like the room is just naturally a little dim. And this is where the passage stops being a correction of a misused Bible verse and starts being something closer to an offer. Because Jesus doesn't tell the crowd on that hillside to stop caring about the speck. He doesn't tell them the speck doesn't matter, or that other people's failures are none of their business. He tells them what has to happen before they'll be able to see clearly enough to help. Self-examination isn't the end of the process. It's what makes the rest of it trustworthy, which means the hardest part of this teaching was never the judging. It's the going first, looking honestly at what's lodged in your own eye before you say a word about anyone else's. That's slower. It's less satisfying. It doesn't feel like clarity in the moment, but it's the only way the rest of the sentence ever gets to happen at all. Maybe the log was never meant to disqualify you from the speck. Maybe it was meant to teach you how to hold it gently. If this is the kind of study you didn't know you needed, the kind that hands the text back to you slower and closer than you've read it before, consider staying for the next one. The Scripture Project exists for people who want more than the verse everyone quotes. If this opens something up for you, share it with someone who's only ever heard the first two words. And if you have a moment, tell us in the comments what you saw here for the first time. There's always another layer waiting underneath the verse you thought you already knew.